Annetta Gibson had worked at the Westbridge estate for 32 years. She knew every corner of that sprawling mansion, every creak in the grand staircase, every way the morning light spilled through the nursery windows. But more than that, she knew the people who lived there. She had cared for little Thomas Westbridge from the day his mother died, rocking him through his nightmares, teaching him to read, becoming the steady presence in his grief-stricken world. Mr. Westbridge was getting married today, and Annetta had polished every silver piece, pressed every tablecloth, and arranged every white rose with meticulous care. This was supposed to be a new beginning for the family, a chance for Thomas to have a mother again. The afternoon sun cast golden light across the manicured lawn as guests began arriving in their expensive cars. Annetta stood near the garden entrance in her crisp orange and white uniform, watching the celebration unfold. Her duties were simple today: make sure everything ran smoothly, attend to any last-minute needs, and fade quietly into the background, as she'd always done. Then she saw Thomas. The boy stood near the ceremony arch in his miniature suit, perfectly tailored but hanging loose on his small frame. He looked like he was dressed for a funeral, not a wedding. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Thomas's body, it wasn't the same at all. Annetta's heart began to pound. The child before her had Thomas's height for an 8-year-old, his sandy brown hair neatly combed, his small hands clasped in front of him. But he looked skeletal, gaunt. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken deep into dark circles. His wrists protruded from his jacket, sleeves like fragile twigs. The healthy, vibrant boy she'd known just 6 months ago had vanished. For a moment, Annetta wondered if the distance was playing tricks on her vision. She moved closer, squinting against the sun. No, she had raised this child through his darkest days. She had measured his growth against the kitchen doorframe, made his favorite meals, kissed his forehead when fevers broke. A mother knows. And Annetta had been more of a mother to Thomas than anyone else in that grand house. What had happened to him? Annetta's mind raced through possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. Was he sick, dying? How had he deteriorated so rapidly? She noticed the way he stood perfectly still, almost frozen, his eyes fixed on the ground. That wasn't how Thomas behaved. Thomas was full of energy, curiosity, laughter. This child looked terrified. The groom, Richard Westbridge, stood at the altar looking proud and nervous, adjusting his boutonniere. He seemed completely oblivious to his son's condition. Beside him stood his best man, but Annetta's eyes were drawn to the bride. Natalie Pearson glided down the aisle in an exquisite ivory gown, her blonde hair swept into an elegant updo, her smile radiant for the cameras. She looked like perfection itself, poised, beautiful, every inch the sophisticated society bride. But as Natalie passed Thomas, Annetta saw something that made her blood run cold. The boy flinched. It was subtle, just a slight recoil, a tightening of his small shoulders, a flicker of pure fear across his gaunt face. And Natalie's eyes, just for a split second when no one else was looking, cut toward the child with a look of such cold contempt that Annetta felt it like a physical blow. Then the bride's mask slipped back into place, and she was all grace and joy again. Annetta took a deep breath. 32 years of quiet service had taught her to observe, to understand, to know when something precious was at risk. She thought of all the times Thomas had come to the kitchen seeking comfort, sitting at the old wooden table while she baked cookies, talking about missing his mother, about feeling invisible in the big house. This wedding was supposed to give him a family again. But as Annetta watched Thomas stand there, skeletal, trembling, silent, she realized with growing horror that this wedding might be the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him. She walked forward slowly, her sensible shoes quiet on the grass. Her uniform, the orange dress with its white collar and cuffs that marked her as staff, suddenly felt like armor. She had every right to be here. This was her home too, in its own way. As she moved closer to where Thomas stood, She caught fragments of whispered conversation. Natalie leaning down toward the boy, her voice saccharine for nearby guests. "Stand up straight, darling, and remember what I told you, not one word, or you know what happens." Thomas's jaw tightened. His thin hands trembled. Annetta stopped a few feet away. Several guests had begun to notice her presence, wondering why the maid was moving through the ceremony area. But Annetta's eyes were fixed on Thomas, on the bruise barely visible beneath his collar, on the way his suit hung on his emaciated frame, on the silent plea in his hollow eyes. And in that moment, she made her decision. Annetta couldn't look away from Thomas. The ceremony had begun, the officiant's voice droning on about love and commitment and sacred bonds, but the words might as well have been in another language. All she could see was the boy. 6 months ago, Thomas had been healthy. Not just healthy, thriving. He'd burst into the kitchen after school, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, eager to tell her about the science project he was building or the goal he'd almost scored in soccer. He'd had round cheeks that flushed pink when he ran, bright eyes that sparkled with mischief, arms that were solid and strong when he'd wrap them around her waist for a hug. This child standing at the altar bore almost no resemblance to that boy. Annetta's hands trembled as she gripped her service tray. She tried to rationalize what she was seeing. Perhaps it was the harsh afternoon light creating shadows. Perhaps the formal suit was cut oddly, making him appear thinner than he was. Perhaps she was overreacting, letting her maternal instincts cloud her judgment. But then Thomas shifted his weight, and his jacket pulled tight across his back. Even from 20 feet away, Annetta could see the outline of his shoulder blades jutting sharply beneath the fabric. His wrists, emerging from his sleeves as he clasped his hands, looked like fragile bird bones. His neck seemed too thin to support his head. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was starvation. Annetta moved closer, weaving between guests with practiced invisibility. She needed to see his face clearly, needed to confirm what her heart already knew. When she finally had an unobstructed view, her breath caught in her throat. Thomas's face had lost all its childish roundness. His cheeks were hollow, creating deep shadows beneath his cheekbones. His eyes sat in dark, bruised-looking sockets, making them appear enormous and glassy. His lips were pale, almost bloodless. But it was his expression that devastated her most, the vacant, defeated look of someone who had given up hoping for rescue. A guest shifted, and sunlight fell directly across Thomas's face. That's when Annetta saw them. Bruises. A yellowing mark along his jawline, partially concealed by careful positioning. A darker purple shadow on his temple, artfully covered by the way his hair had been combed. And when he turned slightly, reaching up to adjust his collar with shaking fingers, she caught a glimpse of fingerprint-shaped bruises encircling his thin wrist like a grotesque bracelet. Annetta's professional composure cracked. She took an involuntary step forward, her tray tilting dangerously. A champagne flute slid toward the edge, and she caught it just before it fell, the crystal chiming softly. The sound made Thomas's head snap toward her. For one brief moment, their eyes met. What Annetta saw in that gaze shattered her completely. It wasn't just pain or hunger. It was terror. Pure, absolute terror. And beneath that, something worse, resignation. The look of a child who had screamed for help until his voice gave out, who had learned that no one was coming. Thomas's eyes pleaded with her, even as his mouth remained closed. Even as his body remained perfectly still in the spot where Natalie had positioned him. "Help me," his eyes said. "Please, someone help me." The ceremony continued, but Annetta barely heard the vows being exchanged. Her entire focus had narrowed to 2 people, Thomas and Natalie Pearson, the woman who was about to become his stepmother. Natalie stood at the altar, radiating elegance. Her ivory gown caught the afternoon light, making her seem to glow. Her smile was warm and genuine as she gazed at Richard, her voice trembling with apparent emotion as she repeated her vows. Several guests dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even the officiant seemed moved by the display of devotion. But Annetta had spent 3 decades learning to see what others missed, and what she saw made her skin crawl. When Natalie turned slightly to adjust her bouquet, her eyes swept past Thomas. The warmth vanished instantly, replaced by something cold and calculating. It lasted only a second before her expression softened again, but Annetta had seen it. That look wasn't love or even mild affection. It was contempt, ownership, control. The ceremony concluded with applause and cheers. Richard kissed his new bride, and guests rose to their feet, throwing rose petals as the couple walked down the aisle. Natalie waved graciously, accepting congratulations, her face the picture of joy. As they passed Thomas, Natalie reached out and placed her hand on the boy's shoulder. To the guests, it must have looked like a tender gesture, a new mother welcoming her stepson. But Annetta saw Thomas's entire body go rigid. She saw Natalie's perfectly manicured fingers dig into the hollow of his shoulder, her grip tightening until the boy's face went white. She saw Natalie lean down, still smiling brilliantly for the cameras, and whisper something in his ear. Whatever she said made Thomas's eyes fill with tears that he desperately tried to blink back. Then Natalie released him, patted his cheek with false affection, and glided away, her hand slipping back into Richard's arm. The entire interaction had taken perhaps 5 seconds. No one else had noticed anything amiss, except Annetta. She moved through the crowd as the guests began migrating toward the reception area, her mind racing. She needed to think, to remember, to piece together what had been happening right under her nose. The champagne reception was held on the south lawn, beneath white tents strung with crystal chandeliers. Annetta resumed her duties, offering canapés and refilling glasses, but her attention never strayed far from Thomas. The boy had been positioned at a small table near the edge of the tent, away from the main festivities. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes downcast. A plate of food sat untouched before him, delicate finger sandwiches, fresh fruit, tiny pastries. Any normal 8-year-old would have devoured it eagerly. Thomas didn't even look at it. Natalie held court at the center of the tent, laughing and accepting compliments, her arm linked through Richard's. But every few minutes, Annetta noticed her gaze dart toward Thomas, checking on him like a warden monitoring a prisoner. When a well-meaning aunt approached Thomas's table and tried to engage him in conversation, Natalie materialized almost instantly. She swept in with a practiced smile, placing herself between the aunt and the boy. "Thomas isn't feeling well today," Natalie said, her voice dripping with concern. "He's been having stomach troubles all week. The poor darling can barely keep anything down. I've been so worried about him." She placed her hand on Thomas's head in a mockery of maternal care. "Haven't I, sweetheart?" Thomas nodded silently, his jaw clenched. "Best to let him rest," Natalie continued, gently steering the aunt away. "He gets overwhelmed so easily. The doctor says it's anxiety. Such a sensitive child." The aunt left, looking sympathetic. Natalie waited until she was out of earshot, then bent down close to Thomas's ear. From across the tent, Annetta couldn't hear the words, but she saw the effect they had. Thomas's hands began to shake. A tear rolled down his hollow cheek. Natalie straightened, smoothed her dress, and returned to her guests, all warmth and grace once more. That's when the memories began flooding back. Annetta had been so busy with wedding preparations over the past few months that she'd barely seen Thomas. Natalie had taken over most of his care, insisting that Annetta focus on other household duties. At the time, it had seemed considerate a new mother wanting to bond with her soon-to-be stepson. But now, standing in that tent watching the boy tremble, Annetta remembered the small details she'd dismissed. 3 months ago, Thomas had stopped coming to the kitchen after school. When Annetta asked about it, Natalie had explained that Thomas needed a more structured routine, that she was helping him with his homework in his room. "He's behind in several subjects," she'd said with a concerned frown. "We can't let him fall further back." 2 months ago, Annetta had noticed Thomas seemed quieter, more withdrawn. When she'd mentioned it to Richard, he'd waved it off. Natalie says he's adjusting to the changes. It's normal for children to act out when a parent remarries. She's handling it beautifully. 6 weeks ago, Thomas had supposedly come down with a stomach virus. He'd been confined to his room for days, too ill for visitors. Natalie had taken his meals to him personally, insisting he needed rest and quiet. When Annetta had tried to check on him, she'd found his door locked. "Doctor's orders," Natalie had said firmly. "He's highly contagious." 4 weeks ago, the stomach troubles had supposedly become chronic. Thomas missed school regularly. He ate his meals in his room. The few times Annetta glimpsed him in the hallways, he seemed thinner, paler, more listless. But Natalie always had an explanation. "He's not sleeping well. The new medication makes him tired. The doctor says it's just a phase." And Annetta, busy with her duties and trusting that a mother would care for her child, had accepted these explanations. Now she saw them for what they were: lies. Carefully constructed lies designed to isolate Thomas, to explain away his deterioration, to ensure no one looked too closely. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't neglect. This was deliberate, systematic. Natalie had been hurting Thomas slowly, methodically, while presenting herself as the devoted stepmother-to-be. But why? Annetta's eyes found Richard across the tent. He stood surrounded by business associates, beaming with pride, toasting his new marriage. He was a wealthy man, not just wealthy, but extraordinarily so. The Westbridge fortune was substantial, and Thomas was his only heir. Unless something happened to Thomas. The thought made Annetta's blood run cold. If Thomas were to die, or be deemed unfit, or simply disappear from the picture, who would inherit? A grieving widower might very well leave everything to his devoted second wife, the woman who'd stood by him through tragedy. Annetta watched Natalie work the crowd, collecting congratulations and well wishes like trophies. She watched the woman's eyes continually track back to Thomas, making sure he remained compliant, silent, controlled. She watched the boy sit at his isolated table, growing smaller and more transparent by the moment, as if he were slowly erasing himself from existence. And she understood with horrifying clarity that if no one intervened, Thomas Westbridge would not survive this marriage. The question was, who would believe her? She was just the maid, after all. Natalie was wealthy, educated, charming, a pillar of society. She'd fooled everyone, including Richard himself. What chance did Annetta have against such a perfect facade? But then Thomas looked up, and their eyes met again across the crowded tent. The desperation in his gaze was unmistakable. Annetta made her decision. She didn't know how yet, but she would find a way to expose Natalie. She would find proof. She would save this child, even if it cost her everything. Because some things mattered more than keeping your place, more than protecting your livelihood, more than maintaining the comfortable silence of service. Some things, like a child's life, were worth any risk. The reception was in full swing when Annetta saw her opportunity. Natalie was engaged in animated conversation with a group of society women, holding court like a queen. Richard had been pulled away by business associates, deep in discussion about some merger or acquisition. Thomas remained at his isolated table, still as a statue, still untouched by the celebration around him. Annetta set down her serving tray and slipped away from the tent. No one noticed. That was the advantage of being staff. You were essentially invisible, unless someone needed something. She walked quickly across the lawn toward the main house, her heart pounding. She didn't have much time. 15 minutes, maybe 20 if she was lucky. But she needed evidence, something concrete, something that couldn't be dismissed as the paranoid imaginings of an overprotective maid. The house was quiet, empty. All the staff were outside managing the reception. Annetta's footsteps echoed on the marble floors as she climbed the grand staircase to the second floor where the family bedrooms were located. Thomas's room was at the end of the hall. The same room he'd occupied since he was a baby. Annetta had decorated it herself after his mother died, choosing soft blues and whites, filling it with books and toys, trying to create a space where a grieving child might feel safe. She reached for the doorknob and turned. Locked. Annetta's breath caught. Thomas's door had never been locked. Not once in 8 years. Children needed to be able to come and go, to run to an adult if they had nightmares, to feel they weren't trapped. She pulled out her master keyring, something she'd carried for 3 decades, keys to every room in the house. Her hands shook as she found the right one and unlocked the door. The room that greeted her was nothing like the sanctuary she remembered. The cheerful blue walls seemed darker somehow, oppressive. The toys had been removed, the bookshelves cleared. The space felt sterile, institutional, like a prison cell dressed up as a bedroom. But it was the smell that hit her first. A sharp, chemical odor mixed with something else, something sour and wrong. The smell of sickness. Annetta moved deeper into the room, her professional eye cataloging details. The bed was neatly made with military precision. The desk was clear, except for a single textbook and a pencil, positioned with unnatural exactness. No clutter, no mess, no signs of a child actually living here. She checked the closet first. Thomas's clothes hung in perfect rows, organized by color and type. But as she touched them, she realized they were all wrong. The shirts, the pants, they were the same size they'd been 6 months ago. Natalie hadn't bought him anything new, hadn't adjusted for growth. Because Thomas wasn't growing. He was shrinking. Annetta turned to the small adjoining bathroom. More chemical smells. She opened the medicine cabinet and felt her stomach drop. Bottles of pills lined the shelves. Far too many for a healthy 8-year-old. She picked them up one by one, reading the labels. Ambien, Xanax, Benadryl in adult doses. All prescribed to Thomas Westbridge. All signed by Dr. Harrison Bentley, a physician Annetta had never heard of. She grabbed her phone and quickly searched the name. Dr. Harrison Bentley had lost his medical license 2 years ago for improperly prescribing controlled substances. The prescriptions were fake. With trembling hands, Annetta photographed each bottle, each label. She checked the dosages, the quantities. Some of the bottles were nearly empty. Natalie had been giving these to Thomas regularly, sedating him, keeping him compliant and confused. But there was more. Behind the pill bottles, she found a small brown bottle with no label. She unscrewed the cap carefully and sniffed. The acrid smell made her jerk back. She didn't know exactly what it was, but her instincts screamed poison. She photographed that too. In the cabinet under the sink, she found something that made her heart race. A box of syringes. Several empty vials that had once contained clear liquid, and a medical reference book opened to a page about insulin overdose in non-diabetics. Symptoms of hypoglycemia were highlighted in yellow. Confusion, weakness, seizures, loss of consciousness. Natalie had been researching how to hurt him, how to make it look like natural illness. Annetta's hands shook as she documented everything with her phone. But she needed more. She needed something in Thomas's own words, something that would be undeniable. She moved to his desk and carefully opened the drawers. The first 2 were empty. The third contained school supplies arranged with the same unnatural precision. But the bottom drawer was locked. Annetta examined the small lock. It was cheap, decorative, the kind that came on children's diaries or jewelry boxes. She found a paper clip on the desk and worked it into the mechanism. After a few seconds of fumbling, it clicked open. Inside was a composition notebook with a blue cover, the kind elementary school children used for writing assignments. Annetta lifted it out with reverent care and opened to the first page. The handwriting was Thomas's she'd know it anywhere. She'd helped him practice his letters at the kitchen table, praised his improvement, corrected his spelling. But this handwriting was shakier than she remembered, the letters uneven, as if written by a hand that trembled. The first entry was dated 4 months ago. Dad married Natalie today. She said we'd be a family again. She smiled at me during the wedding. Maybe she'll be nice like Mom was. Annetta's eyes blurred with tears, but she forced herself to keep reading. The entries that followed documented a nightmare. Natalie says I eat too much. She locked the pantry. I'm hungry. She gave me medicine that makes me sleepy. I don't like it. I told Dad, but he says I should listen to her. I threw up again. Natalie says it's because I'm ungrateful. She says if I tell anyone, she'll say I'm lying. No one believes children who lie. My stomach hurts all the time. I'm so hungry. I tried to get food from the kitchen, but Natalie caught me. She hit me. She said it was my fault for being sneaky. Dad doesn't see. He's always working. Natalie is nice when he's around. She's different when he leaves. I'm scared. She's hurting me. Dad doesn't see. The entries became shorter, more desperate. The handwriting increasingly erratic. Hungry. Sick again. Please, someone help. I want Mom. The last entry was dated 1 week ago. Just 3 words, written so faintly Annetta almost couldn't read them. I'm going to die. Annetta clutched the notebook to her chest, tears streaming down her face. This was it. This was the evidence. Thomas's own testimony, written in his childish hand, documenting months of systematic abuse. She photographed every page carefully, making sure each word was legible. Then she returned the notebook to its hiding place, relocked the drawer. She needed to leave everything as she'd found it. Natalie couldn't know anyone had been here. But before she left, Annetta checked one more place, the small closet where Thomas used to keep his snacks and juice boxes. It had been his little indulgence, his private stash for when he got hungry between meals. The closet now had a padlock on it. Annetta used another key from her ring and opened it. Inside, she found shelves full of food cookies, crackers, granola bars, juice boxes. All of Thomas's favorites. All locked away where he could see them but never reach them. This was torture. Deliberate, calculated torture of a child. Annetta locked the closet again and stepped back, her mind reeling. She had her evidence now. The fake prescriptions, the sedatives, the poison, the diary, the locked food storage. But as she stood in that horrible room, she realized something that made her blood run cold. She'd been searching for evidence to prove systematic abuse. What she'd found was evidence of attempted murder. Natalie wasn't just hurting Thomas. She was killing him slowly, methodically, making it look like chronic illness. And judging by that last diary entry, judging by the boy's skeletal appearance, she was very close to succeeding. Annetta checked her phone. She'd been gone 18 minutes. She needed to get back before she was missed. But first, she sent the photographs to her own email account, then to a cloud storage service, then to her daughter's phone with a message, "Urgent. Do not delete. Evidence of child abuse. If anything happens to me, take this to the police." Only then did she slip out of Thomas's room, lock the door behind her, and hurry back down the stairs. She had the evidence. Now she needed the courage to use it. And she needed to act fast, because Thomas Westbridge was running out of time. Annetta stood in the hallway outside Thomas's room, her hand pressed against the wall to steady herself. The evidence burned in her phone, in her memory, in her conscience. She had what she needed. Now came the impossible part. Actually doing something about it. Her legs felt weak as she made her way back down the grand staircase. Through the tall windows, she could see the reception continuing on the lawn. The white tents glowed in the afternoon sun. Guests laughed and danced. Champagne flowed. It looked like something from a fairy tale. But Annetta knew now that fairy tales could have monsters hiding in plain sight. She reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, her reflection staring back at her from the ornate mirror in the foyer. Weathered hands that had scrubbed and polished and cared for every corner of the Westbridge estate. What could those hands do against someone like Natalie Pearson? Annetta thought about what would happen if she spoke up. She could see it all so clearly, like watching a film she'd already seen. She would approach Richard at his own wedding reception. She would interrupt his celebration to accuse his new bride, the woman he'd just vowed to love and cherish, of systematically abusing and poisoning his son. She would present her evidence: photographs taken without permission, a diary she'd read by breaking into a locked drawer, suspicions based on observations that could easily be explained away. And Natalie would respond with perfect wounded dignity. She would produce her own evidence, doctor's notes, about Thomas's chronic anxiety, his behavioral problems, his refusal to eat. She would have witnesses, respected physicians, documentation. She would paint herself as the devoted stepmother trying desperately to help a troubled child, and Annetta as the jealous servant who resented being replaced in the boy's life. Richard would have to choose between his new wife and his maid. The choice was obvious. Annetta would be fired. 32 years of loyal service would end with her escorted off the property, her reputation destroyed. Word would spread through the network of wealthy families: Annetta Gibson, the unstable maid who made wild accusations. She would never work in a respectable household again. Her pension, her retirement, her small apartment that she'd been saving for all of it, would disappear. At 63, she would be starting over with nothing. No references, no prospects, no future. And Thomas would still be trapped with his abuser, only now there would be no one watching. No one who knew the truth. Natalie would win completely. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to say nothing, to quietly send her evidence to Child Protective Services through an anonymous tip. Let the authorities handle it. Protect herself while still trying to help Thomas. But Annetta had worked with CPS before, years ago when another family's nanny had suspected abuse. She knew how these things went. They would schedule an investigation. They would call ahead, giving Natalie time to prepare. They would interview Thomas while Natalie was present, and the terrified boy would say nothing, just like he'd been conditioned to do. They would see a wealthy, articulate woman with impressive medical documentation and a clean home. They would see no immediate danger. The case would be closed. Thomas would be left with Natalie. And Natalie would know someone had reported her. She would know she needed to move faster, be more careful. She would kill Thomas before anyone could stop her. No, an anonymous tip wasn't enough. This needed to be public, immediate, undeniable. It needed to happen now, while there were witnesses, while Thomas was still alive to be saved, which meant Annetta had to be the one to do it. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she was back in time. 3 years ago, the day of Catherine Westbridge's funeral. Thomas had been only 5 years old, small for his age, drowning in his formal black suit. He'd stood at the graveside holding his father's hand, his face blank with shock. He hadn't cried during the service. He hadn't made a sound. But that night, Annetta had heard sobbing coming from his room. She'd found him curled in his bed, clutching his mother's scarf, his small body shaking with grief. "She's gone," he'd whispered when Annetta sat beside him. "Mommy's gone and she's never coming back." Annetta had gathered him into her arms, this tiny, broken child, and rocked him the way she'd rocked her own children decades ago. "I know, sweetheart. I know it hurts. Who's going to take care of me?" Thomas had asked, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Who's going to love me now?" "I will," Annetta had promised. "I'm right here. I'll always be right here." She'd meant it. She'd rocked him until his sobs quieted, until his breathing evened out, until he fell into exhausted sleep. And she'd made a silent vow to Catherine's memory. "I'll watch over him. I'll keep him safe." For 3 years, she'd kept that promise. But then Natalie had arrived with her perfect smile and her perfect lies, and Annetta had failed. She'd let herself be pushed aside. She'd accepted the explanations, trusted that a mother would care for her child, allowed herself to be distracted by wedding preparations while Thomas suffered behind locked doors. She'd broken her promise, but she could still keep it. She could still save him, even if it cost her everything. Annetta opened her eyes and looked at her reflection again. The woman staring back at her looked tired, old, insignificant, just a maid in an orange uniform, easily dismissed and easily replaced. But she was also the only person in Thomas's life who saw the truth. The only person who loved him enough to risk everything. The only person standing between him and death. Sometimes that's all it took. One person willing to speak up, one person refusing to stay silent. Annetta thought about her apartment, her savings, her comfortable retirement. She thought about the security she'd worked 32 years to build. She thought about how easy it would be to walk away, to tell herself she'd done what she could. Then she thought about Thomas sitting at that table, skeletal and terrified, believing no one cared enough to save him. She thought about his diary entry, "I'm going to die." She thought about finding his small body one morning, cold and still, while Natalie played the role of devastated stepmother, and everyone believed the lie. The decision crystallized in that moment, solid and unshakable as stone. She would speak up. She would confront Natalie publicly, in front of all these witnesses. She would show Richard the evidence, force him to see what was being done to his son. She would endure the humiliation, the accusations, the consequences. She would lose her job, her security, her reputation. But Thomas would live, and that was worth anything, worth everything. Annetta straightened her uniform, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the doors leading to the reception. Her hands no longer shook. Her step was steady. She felt something she hadn't felt in 3 decades of quiet service. She felt powerful, not because of money or status or position, but because she'd chosen to do the right thing, regardless of cost. Because she'd decided that a child's life mattered more than her own comfort. Because 32 years ago, she'd chosen a life of service, and service meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves even when no one was watching, even when it came at tremendous personal cost. Through the windows, she could see Natalie laughing at something a guest had said, her hand resting possessively on Richard's arm. She could see Thomas, still alone at his table, getting smaller and more transparent by the moment. Not anymore, Annetta thought. No more silence, no more looking away. She pushed open the doors and walked back into the sunlight, toward the reception tent, toward the confrontation that would change everything, toward the moment when she would finally keep her promise to Catherine Westbridge. "I'm right here, Thomas. I'm right here, and I'm not staying quiet anymore." The reception had reached that golden hour when champagne made everyone sentimental and the toasts began. Richard stood at the center of the tent, his arm around Natalie's waist, beaming as his best man raised a glass and launched into a speech about love and second chances and new beginnings. Annetta moved through the crowd, positioning herself where she could be seen and heard. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady now. She'd made her choice. There was no turning back. The best man finished to applause and laughter. Richard's business partner stood next, offering congratulations and making jokes about Richard finally finding someone who could keep him organized. More laughter, more applause. Then Natalie's maid of honor rose, a sleek woman in a designer dress who spoke about how Natalie had transformed Richard's life, brought light back into his home, became a mother to his precious son. That last phrase, mother to his precious son, echoed in Annetta's ears. She looked at Thomas, still sitting alone at his isolated table, and something inside her snapped. As the maid of honor sat down amid enthusiastic clapping, Annetta stepped forward into the center of the tent. "Excuse me." Her voice cut through the celebratory atmosphere like a blade. "I have something to say." The crowd went quiet. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. 200 guests in formal attire stared at the maid in the orange uniform who had dared to interrupt. Richard's smile faltered. "Annetta, this isn't really the time. When was the last time you truly looked at your son?" Annetta's voice didn't waver. She kept her eyes locked on Richard, not glanced at him, not smiled at him in passing. "When did you last really see Thomas?" Richard blinked, confused. What? Your son is sitting right there." Annetta pointed to the small table at the edge of the tent. When did you last look at him? The guests began to murmur. Some craned their necks to see Thomas. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't how wedding receptions were supposed to go. Natalie's expression remained perfectly composed, but Annetta saw her eyes harden. Richard, darling, perhaps we should look at him. Annetta's voice grew stronger. Look at your son. Really look at him. Richard turned toward Thomas's table, irritation flickering across his face. This was his wedding day, his celebration. What was his maid doing? But as his eyes found Thomas, something changed in his expression. The irritation faded, replaced by confusion, then a flicker of concern. He's lost weight, Richard said slowly, as if seeing it for the first time. He looks skeletal, Annetta finished. He looks like a child who's been starving for months. Because he has been. The murmurs grew louder. Guests shifted uncomfortably. This had gone from awkward to disturbing. Natalie laughed, a light, dismissive sound. This is ridiculous. Richard, your maid is clearly having some sort of episode. Perhaps we should call someone. When did you last see Thomas eat a full meal? Annetta kept her focus on Richard. When did you last see him smile? Play? Act like a healthy 8-year-old boy? Richard's face had gone pale. He's been ill. Natalie's been managing his care, the doctors said. What doctors? Annetta challenged. Dr. Harrison Bentley? The physician who lost his medical license 2 years ago for prescribing controlled substances illegally? Natalie's mask slipped. Just for a second, her expression went cold and hard before she recovered. How dare you? You have no right to make such accusations. You're clearly jealous that I've taken your place in this family. I found the prescriptions, Annetta continued, her voice ringing clear across the silent tent. In Thomas's bathroom, Ambien, Xanax, Benadryl, all in adult doses for an 8-year-old child, all prescribed by a doctor who doesn't legally exist anymore. I found the syringes, the unmarked bottles, the medical reference book open to pages about insulin overdose. The crowd erupted. Gasps of shock, voices raised in disbelief. Several guests pulled out their phones. This is insane, Natalie's voice rose, her composure cracking. She's lying. She broke into my stepson's room like some kind of criminal. I found his diary. Annetta pulled out her phone, holding it up. Thomas keeps a diary. Would you like me to read what he wrote? She's hurting me. Dad doesn't see. That's what your son wrote, Mr. Westbridge. I'm so hungry. I tried to get food, but Natalie caught me. She hit me. That's enough. Natalie's face had gone white with fury. Richard, are you going to let this woman destroy our wedding with these fabrications? But Richard wasn't looking at Natalie anymore. He was staring at Thomas. And for the first time in months, he was really seeing him. The hollow cheeks, the sunken eyes, the way the boy's suit hung on his frame like a scarecrow's clothes, the bruises barely visible on his thin wrists. My God, Richard whispered. Thomas? Annetta pressed her advantage, her voice urgent. She's been poisoning him, starving him, sedating him to keep him compliant. She locks the pantry so he can't get food. She gives him medications that make him sick, then tells you it's chronic illness. She's been systematically destroying your son, and she's been doing it right under your nose. You jealous, pathetic woman, Natalie snarled, all pretense of composure gone now. You can't stand that I've replaced you, that Richard chose me over you. You're nothing but a servant who's forgotten her place. His last diary entry was 1 week ago, Annetta continued, speaking over Natalie's outburst. I'm going to die. That's what your 8-year-old son wrote, Mr. Westbridge. 3 words. I'm going to die. And he believes it because it's true. She's killing him. And she's been planning it for months. Richard took a step toward Thomas's table. The boy sat frozen, his eyes wide with terror, looking between Annetta and Natalie like a trapped animal. Thomas, Richard's voice cracked. Son, come here. Thomas didn't move. His eyes darted to Natalie, fear plain on his face. "It's all right," Annetta said gently. "You're safe now, sweetheart. You can tell the truth." "Don't you dare!" Natalie's voice was low and dangerous. She took a step toward Thomas, and the boy flinched visibly. That flinch, that instinctive recoil from the woman who was supposed to be his mother, told Richard everything he needed to know. "Stay away from him." Richard's voice went cold. He moved between Natalie and Thomas. And suddenly he wasn't a besotted groom anymore. He was a father who'd just woken up to find his child in danger. "Don't you touch him. Richard, you can't possibly believe this nonsense. Show me your arm, Thomas." Richard knelt beside his son's chair. "Roll up your sleeve." Thomas's hands trembled as he obeyed. The sleeve pulled back to reveal a constellation of bruises, fingerprints, needle marks, yellowing contusions in various stages of healing. The crowd gasped again. Several women put their hands over their mouths. A man in the back shouted for someone to call the police. Richard's face went from pale to gray. "Who did this to you?" Thomas's voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "Her." He pointed at Natalie with a shaking finger. The tent exploded with noise. Guests were standing now, some shouting, others on their phones. Natalie looked around wildly, seeing her perfect facade crumbling, seeing 200 witnesses to her exposure. "This is a misunderstanding," she tried, her voice desperate now. "The boy is troubled. He hurts himself. The doctors said—" "The boy weighs maybe 50 pounds, Annetta said flatly. "He can barely stand. He has poison in his system and fake prescriptions in his bathroom, and he's terrified of you. Those aren't misunderstandings. That's abuse. That's attempted murder." Natalie's eyes locked on Annetta with pure hatred. "You've destroyed everything. You had no right." "I had every right." Annetta stepped forward, placing herself between Natalie and Thomas. "I'm his family. I've cared for him since his mother died. I promised I would protect him. And I'm keeping that promise, even if it means losing everything." Richard scooped Thomas into his arms. The boy weighed nothing, a bundle of bones and skin that should have been a healthy, growing child. Thomas buried his face in his father's shoulder and finally, began to cry. "Someone call 911. Richard's voice was shaking. "My son needs a hospital. And someone call the police." Natalie looked around desperately, but there was nowhere to run. The guests had formed a loose circle around her, blocking the exits. Her wedding day had become her arrest, and Annetta, watching it all unfold, felt something in her chest loosen. Relief. Overwhelming, knee-weakening relief. She'd done it. She'd spoken up. She'd saved him. Whatever happened to her now, Thomas would live, and that was worth everything. The chaos in the tent continued to swirl around them, guests shouting, phones ringing, Natalie's desperate protests, but Annetta's entire focus narrowed to the small boy in his father's arms. Thomas clung to Richard like a drowning child clutching driftwood, his thin body racked with sobs. But even in his father's embrace, Annetta could see the tension in his small frame, the way he kept glancing toward Natalie, the fear that hadn't left his eyes. He'd been conditioned too well, trained through months of cruelty to believe that speaking the truth would only make things worse. Annetta moved closer, her movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle him. She knelt on the grass beside Richard's chair, bringing herself to Thomas's eye level. "Thomas," she said softly. "Sweetheart, look at me." The boy's tear-filled eyes found hers. Even now, even surrounded by witnesses and held by his father, he looked terrified. "You're safe now," Annetta told him, her voice gentle but firm. "I promise you, you're safe. No one is going to hurt you anymore." Thomas shook his head frantically, his words coming out in gasps between sobs. "You don't understand," she said. "She said if I told." "I know what she said." Annetta reached out and gently took one of his small hands in both of hers. His fingers were ice cold, bones visible beneath paper-thin skin. But she can't hurt you now. Your father is here. I'm here. All these people are here. She can't do anything to you. But she'll say I'm lying. Thomas's voice was barely audible. She always says I'm lying. She says no one believes children who lie. Richard made a sound like he'd been punched. His arms tightened around his son. I believe you, Thomas. I believe you. I'm so sorry I didn't see. The medicine makes me confused, Thomas continued, his words tumbling out now in a rush. She gives me pills and I can't think right. I can't remember things. She said the doctors told her to give them to me, but they make me so tired and my stomach hurts. I know, baby. Annetta squeezed his hand gently. We found the pills. We know they were wrong. We know what she was doing. Thomas's eyes went wide. You found them? But she keeps everything locked. She locks the pantry in my room and she counts all the food to make sure I don't take anything. Tell your father, Annetta encouraged. Tell him everything. He needs to hear it from you. Thomas looked up at Richard, his thin face streaked with tears. For a long moment, he just stared, as if trying to see if his father was really there, really listening, really believing. I'm here, son, Richard said, his own voice breaking. I'm listening. I should have been listening all along. Something in Thomas seemed to crack open. The dam he'd built to hold back months of suffering broke, and the truth poured out. She started being mean right after you proposed, Thomas said, his words coming faster now. She was nice before that, when you were dating. But after you asked her to marry you, she changed. She said I ate too much. She said I was fat and disgusting and I needed to learn some discipline. Richard's face had gone ashen. Several guests nearby had stopped their phone conversations to listen, horror written across their faces. She started locking the pantry, Thomas continued. And the refrigerator. She gave me smaller and smaller portions at meals. She said I needed to lose weight, but I was so hungry all the time. My stomach hurt so much. Oh, God. Richard pressed his lips to Thomas's forehead. Why didn't you tell me? I tried. Thomas's voice rose, anguish clear in every word. I tried to tell you, but she was always there. And when I did tell you, she said I was being dramatic. She showed you papers from doctors saying I had anxiety and behavioral problems. She said I was making things up for attention because I was jealous of her. I remember, Richard whispered, his expression stricken. I remember you trying to talk to me. And I told you to give Natalie a chance. I told you. He couldn't finish. The realization of his failure was too overwhelming. Thomas wasn't done. Now that he'd started, all the horror he'd been holding inside came spilling out. When I tried to sneak food, she caught me. She hit me. His voice dropped to a whisper. She hit me so hard I fell down. She said if I told anyone, she'd say I was lying. She said everyone would believe her because she's an adult and I'm just a kid. Annetta felt tears streaming down her own face, but she held Thomas's hand steady, grounding him. Then she started putting stuff in my food, Thomas said. Something that made me throw up. She said it would help me lose weight faster. But it hurt so bad. I was sick all the time. And she told you I had a stomach virus, remember? She said I needed to stay in my room so I wouldn't infect anyone. For 2 weeks, Richard said hollowly. You were locked in your room for 2 weeks. She gave me shots, Thomas continued, his voice growing smaller. She said they were vitamins, but they made me feel weird, shaky and dizzy and wrong. She kept telling me I was sick, that I had all these problems, that she was helping me. But I wasn't sick before she came. I was fine before her. Around them, the tent had gone completely silent. Even Natalie had stopped protesting. 200 people bore witness as an 8-year-old boy testified to his own systematic torture. I wrote everything in my diary, Thomas said. I hid it in my desk. I thought maybe if something happened to me, someone would find it and know the truth. I thought maybe someone would figure it out. I found it, Annetta told him. I found it today. That's how I knew. Thomas looked at her with something like wonder. You went into my room? I did. I was worried about you. And when I saw you today looking so thin and scared, I knew something terrible was happening. I tried to be good, Thomas said, his voice breaking again. I tried to do everything she said. I thought if I was good enough, she'd stop. But she never stopped. It just got worse. She said once she married Dad, she could do whatever she wanted. She said I was in the way, that Dad would be better off without me. Richard made a sound of pure anguish. No, Thomas, no. You're my son. You're everything to me. She said you didn't really love me, Thomas whispered. She said you just kept me around because you had to, that once you had her, you wouldn't need me anymore. She said maybe I should just disappear. She's a liar, Richard said fiercely. Everything she told you was a lie. You're my son. You're my world. I love you more than anything. Then why didn't you see? Thomas's question was simple, devastating. Why didn't you notice I was dying? The question hung in the air. Richard had no answer. There was no answer that could excuse it. I was blind, Richard finally said. I was so caught up in my own happiness, in finding love again after your mother died, that I stopped paying attention to what mattered most. You. I failed you. I'm so sorry. Thomas buried his face in his father's chest again, his small body shaking with exhaustion and relief and grief. Annetta looked up and saw two police officers making their way through the crowd. Behind them, paramedics carried medical bags. The ambulance is here, sweetheart, she told Thomas gently. They're going to take care of you now. They're going to help you get better. Will you come with me? Thomas asked, his eyes finding Annetta's. Please? I don't want to be alone. I'm not leaving you, Annetta promised. She looked at Richard. If it's all right, I'd like to ride with him to the hospital. Please, Richard said. Please stay with him. I'll follow right behind. The paramedics approached, their expressions professional but compassionate. They'd clearly been briefed on what they were walking into. Hey there, buddy, one of them said to Thomas. We're going to check you out, okay? Make sure you're all right. But as they reached for him, Thomas flinched and grabbed Annetta's hand in a death grip. It's okay, she soothed. They're here to help. I'll be right beside you the whole time. As the paramedics began their assessment, one of the police officers approached Natalie. Ma'am, we need you to come with us. Natalie's face was a mask of fury and desperation. This is a misunderstanding. That child is mentally disturbed. He's been making up stories. Ma'am, the officer said firmly, you have the right to remain silent. As they read Natalie her rights and led her away from the tent, Thomas watched, his hand still gripping Annetta's. Is it really over? He asked quietly. Is she really gone? She's really gone, Annetta assured him, and she's never coming back. For the first time since Annetta had seen him that day, something like hope flickered in Thomas's hollow eyes. The paramedics worked quickly, their practiced efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos erupting around them. One knelt beside Thomas with a blood pressure cuff, while the other prepared an IV line. Their faces remained professionally neutral, but Annetta saw the way their jaws tightened as they took in the boy's condition. Severe malnutrition, the first paramedic said quietly into his radio. Patient is an 8-year-old male, approximately 50 pounds. Signs of dehydration, possible toxicity. We need a gurney and full pediatric trauma support. 50 pounds. Annetta's stomach turned. A healthy 8-year-old should weigh closer to 65 or 70 pounds. Thomas had lost nearly a quarter of his body weight. Around them, the wedding reception had transformed into something unrecognizable. Guests clustered in groups, speaking in hushed, horrified tones. Several women were crying openly. Men stood with their arms crossed, their faces dark with anger. This was supposed to have been a celebration. Instead, they'd witnessed a child's testimony of systematic abuse. Richard stood frozen a few feet away, watching the paramedics work on his son. He looked like a man who'd been struck by lightning, stunned, disoriented, unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened. His wedding suit, so crisp and perfect an hour ago, now looked rumpled and wrong, like a costume from a play that had gone horribly off script. "Mr. Westbridge?" One of the paramedics looked up. "We need to transport him immediately. His vital signs are unstable, heart rate is elevated, blood pressure is low, and he's showing signs of hypoglycemia." "Hypoglycemia?" Richard's voice was hollow. "But he's not diabetic." "No, sir. But it can be induced artificially. We're starting glucose IV now. But we need to get him to the hospital for a full workup." Across the tent, the police officers had Natalie in custody. She'd tried to run when they'd first approached, making it only a few steps before two male guests had blocked her path. Now she stood with her hands behind her back, mascara streaking down her face, her perfect wedding makeup destroyed by tears of rage and panic. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked. "I haven't done anything wrong. That child is disturbed. He's been seeing therapists for months. Ask Dr. Morrison. Ask Dr. Chen. They'll tell you about his behavioral issues, his pathological lying." "We'll be speaking with all of Thomas's doctors," one officer said calmly, "along with reviewing the medical records, the prescriptions, and the physical evidence found in his room. That woman broke into private property." Natalie pointed at Annetta with her bound hands. "She had no right. Anything she found is inadmissible. Actually, ma'am, Mrs. Gibson has worked at this estate for 32 years and has access to all rooms as part of her duties." The officer's voice remained professionally detached. "And even if she didn't, the child's testimony combined with his physical condition gives us probable cause for a full investigation." A detective had arrived, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She moved through the crowd, speaking briefly with several guests, taking statements. When she reached Annetta, she pulled out a notebook. "You're the one who first raised the alarm?" "Yes, ma'am." Annetta's voice was steady despite her exhaustion. "I'm Annetta Gibson. I've been with the Westbridge family for 32 years. And you found evidence in the child's room?" "Yes. I photographed everything and sent it to cloud storage. Fake prescriptions, unauthorized medications, syringes, an unlabeled bottle that smells like poison, and Thomas's diary documenting months of abuse." Annetta pulled out her phone. "I can send you all the photos now." The detective's expression darkened as she scrolled through the images. "Jesus Christ. How long has this been going on?" "I believe it started about 4 months ago, shortly after Mr. Westbridge proposed marriage." "And no one noticed?" Annetta felt the weight of that question. She was very careful. She isolated Thomas, explained away his symptoms as illness, kept him sedated and confused. And Mr. Westbridge, she glanced at Richard, who stood with his face in his hands. He was distracted, in love, trusting, blind, Richard said bitterly, lowering his hands. He'd overheard them. "I was blind. My son was dying in my own house and I didn't see it." The detective turned to him. "Mr. Westbridge, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions. Ask anything. I'll tell you everything I know." Richard's voice was hollow, which apparently is nothing. "I know nothing about what was happening to my own child." As the detective interviewed Richard, another officer approached Natalie with a toxicology kit. "Ma'am, we need to take some samples. We can do it here or at the station." "I want my lawyer." Natalie's composure had completely shattered. "I'm not saying anything without my lawyer present." "That's your right," the officer agreed. "But we're still taking the samples. We have a warrant being expedited based on the child's condition and testimony." A second ambulance had arrived. 2 more paramedics rushed in with a gurney, and Annetta watched as they carefully lifted Thomas onto it. He looked impossibly small against the white sheets, his thin limbs barely making an impression. "Annetta?" Thomas's frightened voice called out. "I'm right here, sweetheart." She moved to his side, taking his hand again. "I'm coming with you, remember? Don't leave me." "Never. I promise." As they wheeled Thomas toward the ambulance, the lead paramedic spoke quietly to his partner. Look at these bruises. Different stages of healing. This has been ongoing for months. And these marks on his arms, those are needle punctures. Multiple sites. Jesus. What kind of monster does this to a kid? Annetta climbed into the ambulance with Thomas, settling onto the small bench beside the gurney. Through the open doors, she could see the reception area, the white tents, the flowers, the champagne glasses abandoned on tables. The beautiful facade of a perfect wedding day, now revealed as the setting for something monstrous. Richard appeared at the ambulance doors. I'm following right behind you. Thomas, I'm not letting you out of my sight again. Okay, Dad. Thomas's voice was weak, but hopeful. As the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, Annetta looked back through the rear windows. She saw Natalie being led to a police car, still protesting, still insisting on her innocence. She saw guests standing in shocked clusters, phones out, no doubt already spreading the story across social media. She saw the detective interviewing witnesses, gathering evidence, and she saw the ruins of what was supposed to have been Natalie's triumph, the wedding that would have sealed her access to the Westbridge fortune, the ceremony that would have given her legal control over Thomas, the moment when all her careful planning would have paid off. At the hospital, Thomas was immediately taken to the pediatric emergency unit. Doctors and nurses swarmed, their movements efficient and purposeful. Annetta stood back, letting them work, but she never let go of Thomas's hand. We need a full talk screen, one doctor ordered. CBC, metabolic panel, liver function, kidney function. And get me x-rays, I want to see if there are any old fractures. Blood glucose is 45, a nurse called out. He's hypoglycemic. Start glucose 4, and someone call Child Protective Services. I want a forensic pediatrician down here now. As they worked, a nurse gently documented every visible injury. The bruises on Thomas's arms, wrists, and neck. The needle marks. The signs of malnutrition, protruding ribs. Visible hip bones. The hollow spaces where healthy muscle should have been. These injuries are consistent with sustained physical abuse, the forensic pediatrician said, an hour later, reviewing the examination results. The malnutrition is severe. We're looking at months of inadequate caloric intake. The toxicology report will take a few days, but based on the symptoms and the boy's testimony, I'd say we're dealing with deliberate poisoning, most likely insulin to induce hypoglycemia, combined with emetics to cause vomiting and prevent nutrient absorption. Richard, who'd been allowed into the room, made a sound of pure anguish. She was killing him. Slowly. Deliberately. Yes, the doctor said bluntly. If this had continued another few weeks, we'd likely be looking at organ failure. You're very lucky Mrs. Gibson intervened when she did. Outside in the hallway, Annetta could hear raised voices. The detective had arrived with more officers. Through the small window in the door, she saw them speaking with hospital administrators, coordinating the investigation. Her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter. Mom, what's happening? Your photos are all over the news. Are you okay? Annetta hadn't realized how big this would become. A society wedding interrupted by child abuse allegations. A wealthy bride arrested at her own reception. It would be everywhere by morning. She texted back. I'm fine. At the hospital with Thomas. He's going to be okay. Another buzz. This time from an unknown number. This is Detective Morrison. We need your full statement. Can you come to the station tomorrow? Yes, she replied. Whatever you need. Richard sat in a chair beside Thomas's hospital bed, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. On the bed, Thomas slept, finally sedated with appropriate medication, his small body connected to IVs and monitors that beeped steadily. I should have seen it, Richard whispered. How did I not see it? Annetta moved to stand beside him. She was very good at hiding it. And you wanted to believe her. You wanted your son to have a mother again. I gave him a monster instead. No, you gave him a future. Because now he's free. Now he's safe. Now he can heal. Richard looked up at her, his eyes red. You saved his life. You risked everything, your job, your security, and you saved him." "I just kept my promise," Annetta said simply. "I promised his mother I'd protect him. That's all I did." Through the hospital window, the sky was darkening. What had started as a beautiful afternoon wedding had become a nightmare that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. But Thomas was alive. Damaged, traumatized, but alive. And Natalie Pearson, who'd planned so carefully to eliminate an innocent child and secure a fortune, was in custody, facing charges that would ensure she never hurt anyone again. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beep of monitors and the soft hiss of oxygen flowing through Thomas's nasal cannula. It was nearly midnight, and the chaos of the afternoon felt like something from another lifetime. Annetta sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair by the window, watching Thomas sleep. The IV fluids had improved his color slightly, bringing a faint flush to his hollow cheeks. The doctors had said he'd need to stay at least a week, possibly longer. His body had been through too much trauma to recover quickly. Richard hadn't left the bedside. He sat hunched forward, his elbows on his knees, still wearing his wedding suit with the tie loosened and the jacket discarded. He'd been silent for the past hour, just staring at his son, as if trying to memorize every detail he'd failed to notice before. Annetta's phone buzzed again. Another news alert. The story had exploded across every media outlet. Society wedding ends in arrest. Bride accused of poisoning stepson. Maid's courage saves child's life. Her photo was everywhere, a grainy image someone had taken at the rest. Reception, showing her standing in her orange uniform, confronting Natalie. She turned off the phone. She didn't need to see any more. A soft knock at the door interrupted the silence. Detective Morrison entered, her expression weary but satisfied. "Mr. Westbridge, Mrs. Gibson." She nodded to them both. "I wanted to update you. Natalie Pearson has been formally charged with attempted murder, child abuse, fraud, and administering poison with intent to harm. The DA is pushing for no bail, given the severity of the charges and flight risk." Richard's hands clenched into fists. "Good. We executed a search warrant on her apartment," the detective continued. "We found extensive documentation of her planning. She kept files on the Westbridge estate, financial records, insurance policies. She'd researched inheritance laws, looked into medications that could mimic natural illness. This wasn't impulsive. This was calculated. She planned to kill my son." Richard's voice was flat, emotionless. The shock had given way to something darker, a cold, terrible understanding. "We believe so, yes. The toxicology reports will take a few more days, but preliminary results show insulin, ipecac syrup, and traces of what appears to be rat poison in Thomas's system. Small doses administered over time to avoid immediate suspicion." Annetta closed her eyes. Rat poison. She'd been feeding a child rat poison. "There's more," Detective Morrison said. "We found communications between Miss Pearson and a man named Marcus Webb. He's a private investigator, and it appears she hired him to research your family before she even met you, Mr. Westbridge. She targeted you specifically, a wealthy widower with a young child. This was a con from the beginning." Richard's face went gray. Everything was a lie. Every moment, every word, every touch, all of it was calculated to get access to my money. "And Thomas was an obstacle," the detective said quietly. "If she could establish herself as your wife, and something happened to your son, she'd be positioned to inherit everything, especially if his death appeared to be from natural causes or chronic illness." The detective paused, then added, "I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of cruelty. But what she did to that child." She looked at Thomas sleeping in the hospital bed. "That's a special kind of evil." After the detective left, the silence returned. Richard continued to stare at his son, and Annetta could see the guilt eating him alive. The doctor said another 2 weeks. Richard finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "If you hadn't intervened today, in another 2 weeks, he would have been dead. Organ failure," they said. His little body couldn't have taken much more. Annetta said nothing. There was nothing to say. I sat next to her at dinner every night, Richard continued. I kissed her goodnight. I told her I loved her. And the whole time she was upstairs poisoning my son. She was killing him, and I was completely oblivious. You didn't know. I should have known. Richard's voice rose, then immediately dropped as Thomas stirred slightly in his sleep. More quietly, he continued. He's my son, my only child, the most important person in my entire world. And I didn't notice he was dying. She was very good at hiding it, Annetta said gently. That's what predators do. They manipulate, they gaslight, they create explanations that sound perfectly reasonable. He tried to tell me. Richard's voice broke. I remember now. 3 months ago, he came to my office. He said he was scared of Natalie, that she was mean to him when I wasn't around. And I told him, he put his face in his hands. I told him he was being dramatic. I told him he needed to give her a chance, that he was just resistant to change because he missed his mother. I sent him away. Annetta remembered that day. She'd seen Thomas leaving Richard's office with tears in his eyes, his small shoulders slumped in defeat. 2 months ago, he tried again. Richard continued. He said Natalie was making him sick, that she wouldn't let him eat. And I called Natalie in, and she showed me doctor's notes about anxiety and behavioral problems. She had such convincing documentation. She seemed so concerned about him, and I believed her instead of him. He looked up at Annetta, his eyes hollow. What kind of father does that? What kind of father chooses a woman he's known for less than a year over his own son's testimony? A father who wanted to believe the best in people, Annetta said quietly. A father who was lonely and grieving and desperate for his family to be whole again. That's not an excuse. No, it's not. But it's a reason. You were vulnerable, Richard. You'd lost your wife. You were raising a young son alone while running an empire. You were exhausted and isolated, and when Natalie came along, she offered you something you desperately wanted, a partner, a helpmeet, a mother for Thomas. You wanted it to be real so badly that you couldn't see it was all performance. I failed him, Richard whispered. Completely and utterly failed him. Yes, Annetta agreed, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. You did. You failed to see what was happening. You failed to listen when he tried to tell you. You failed to protect him from a monster in your own home. Richard flinched at her bluntness. But, Annetta continued, her voice softening, you can choose differently now. You can choose to truly see him, to listen to him, to put him first, always, no matter what. Love made you vulnerable to Natalie's manipulation, but love can also help you rebuild what was broken. How? Richard's voice was desperate. How do I come back from this? How does he ever trust me again? One day at a time. One choice at a time. You show up. You listen. You believe him. You put him first. Annetta leaned forward. Thomas doesn't need you to be perfect, Richard. He needs you to be present. Really present. Not distracted by work or relationships or anything else. He needs to know that you see him, that you hear him, that his well-being matters more than anything else in your world. What if it's too late? What if I've destroyed his ability to trust anyone? It's not too late. He's 8 years old. He's resilient. Children can heal from remarkable trauma if they have consistent, genuine love and support. Annetta looked at Thomas's sleeping face. But you need to do the work. Therapy for both of you. Family counseling. Real time together, not just living in the same house. You need to learn who he actually is, not who you assume he is. Richard nodded slowly. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll quit work if I have to. I'll sell the company. Nothing matters except making this right. Don't make promises you can't keep, Annetta warned. Thomas has had enough of broken promises. Be realistic about what you can do, and then follow through. Every time. Consistency matters more than grand gestures. They sat in silence for a while, watching Thomas breathe. "What's going to happen to you?" Richard finally asked. "Your job, I mean, after everything that's happened." Annetta had been wondering the same thing. She'd expected to be fired immediately after the confrontation. Instead, she'd been so focused on Thomas that she hadn't even thought about her own future. "I don't know," she admitted. "I broke into a locked room. I went through private belongings. I interrupted your wedding and made serious accusations in front of 200 people. By any normal standard, those would be grounds for termination. You saved my son's life. I did my job. I protected a child who needed protecting." Richard looked at her for a long moment. "Annetta, you've worked for my family for 32 years. You knew my wife. You were there when Thomas was born. You've been more of a constant in his life than I have." "That's not true." "It is true. And today you proved that you love him enough to risk everything for him. Your job, your security, your reputation, you were willing to lose it all to save him." Richard's voice grew firm. "I'm not firing you. Ever. In fact, I want to offer you something different." Annetta waited. "Be his guardian. Legally. If something happens to me, I want you to have custody of Thomas, not some distant relative who doesn't know him. I want to put it in writing that your family—" Annetta's eyes filled with tears. "Richard, I mean it. You've earned it. You've proven it. Will you?" She looked at Thomas. This small, broken boy who'd suffered so much, who'd trusted her enough to hope for rescue. "Yes," she said simply. "I will." Outside the hospital window, dawn was beginning to break. The nightmare of yesterday was giving way to the first light of a new day. There would be trials ahead. Legal ones, emotional ones, the long process of healing. But for now, in this quiet room, there was peace. Thomas was safe. Natalie was in custody. And the people who truly loved him were beginning to understand what that love required. Not perfection, not grand gestures, just presence, attention, the willingness to truly see. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding that never was. Thomas sat propped up in his hospital bed, a picture book spread across his lap, while Annetta read aloud in her steady, comforting voice. The story was about a dragon who learned to be brave, one of Thomas's favorites from when he was younger. She'd read it to him dozens of times over the years, and now, as he recovered, he'd asked for it again. The transformation in 3 weeks was remarkable. The hollows in his cheeks had begun to fill out. His eyes, though still carrying shadows of what he'd endured, had regained some of their light. He could sit up without assistance now, could eat small meals without his stomach rejecting them, could smile without it looking like it hurt. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic from the start. Children's bodies were resilient, they'd said. With proper nutrition, rest, and care, Thomas would recover physically. The emotional healing would take longer, but even there, they'd seen progress. Thomas had started talking to the child psychologist, slowly opening up about his ordeal. He had nightmares still, woke up crying for Annetta or his father, but they were becoming less frequent. "Again," Thomas said when Annetta finished the last page. "Again? That's the 3rd time today, sweetheart. I like the ending. When the dragon realizes he was brave all along." Annetta understood. Thomas needed to hear stories about finding courage, about surviving impossible things. She flipped back to the beginning and started over. Halfway through, Richard arrived with a backpack slung over his shoulder. He'd been coming every day, arriving early and staying late. He'd canceled all his business meetings for the month, delegated his responsibilities, and made it clear to everyone that his son was his only priority. "How's my boy doing?" Richard asked, settling into the chair on the other side of the bed. "Good, Dad." "Annetta's reading the dragon book again." "Your favorite?" Richard smiled, and Annetta noticed how different he looked now. Older, certainly the guilt and shock had carved new lines into his face, but also more present, more focused. When he looked at Thomas now, he really saw him. Dr. Patel says maybe 2 more days and I can go home, Thomas said, his voice tentative. Is that okay? The fear in that question broke Annetta's heart. Thomas was still afraid he wasn't wanted, still afraid his father might send him away. More than okay, Richard said firmly. I can't wait to have you home. I've been getting your room ready. My room? Thomas's eyes widened. The same room? Well, I've made some changes. Got rid of anything that might remind you of before. New paint, new furniture, new everything. But I wanted to wait and let you choose the colors and decorations. It's your room, Thomas. You should decide how it looks. Something shifted in Thomas's expression. Really? I get to choose? Anything you want. Within reason, Richard added with a small smile. Probably can't paint it black with glow-in-the-dark stars on every surface, but we can compromise. I was thinking blue, Thomas said shyly. Like the ocean. And maybe some bookshelves? I really like reading now. Annetta felt tears prick her eyes. In the months of Natalie's abuse, Thomas had lost access to his books, his toys, everything that brought him joy. Now he was tentatively reaching for those things again. Blue like the ocean it is, Richard agreed. And as many bookshelves as you want. A nurse came in to check Thomas's vitals and administer his evening medications, real medications this time, proper vitamins and supplements to help his body heal. Thomas took them without protest, no longer associating pills with pain and confusion. After the nurse left, Richard pulled out a folder from his backpack. Thomas, there's something I want to talk to you about. Something important. Thomas tensed slightly, old fears surfacing. Nothing bad, Richard assured him quickly. I promise. It's actually something really good, I think. He opened the folder and pulled out legal documents. You know how much Annetta loves you, right? And how she saved your life? Thomas nodded, reaching for Annetta's hand. Well, I've been talking with lawyers, and I want to make something official. I want Annetta to be your legal co-guardian. That means if anything ever happens to me, she'll take care of you. And it also means she has official say in important decisions about your life. Medical stuff, school, all of it. She'd be family, legally. Thomas looked at Annetta, his eyes wide. You'd be like my mom? Annetta's throat tightened. If you want me to be, sweetheart. I've loved you like my own since the day you were born. This would just make it official. I want that, Thomas said immediately. I want that so much. Then it's settled. Richard smiled, genuine warmth in his expression. I'll file the paperwork this week. Annetta Gibson, welcome to the family. Officially, this time. 2 days later. As promised, Thomas was discharged from the hospital. Annetta and Richard brought him home to the Westbridge estate on a sunny afternoon that felt like a new beginning. Thomas stood on the front steps, staring up at the grand house that had been both his home and his prison. Annetta saw him hesitate, fear flickering across his face. She's not here, Annetta said gently, knowing exactly what he was thinking. She's never coming back. This is your home again, your safe place. You're sure? I'm sure. And I'm going to be here every day. So is your father. You're protected now. They walked through the house together, and Thomas visibly relaxed when he saw the changes. Richard had been busy. All of Natalie's belongings were gone, her clothes, her decorations, every trace of her presence erased. The house looked more like it had when Catherine was alive, warm and welcoming rather than sterile and controlled. Thomas's room was unrecognizable. The oppressive atmosphere had been replaced with space and light. The walls were freshly painted in a soft white, ready for Thomas to choose his ocean blue. New furniture waited to be arranged. Boxes of books sat ready to be shelved. We can decorate it however you want, Richard said. No rush. Take your time and tell us what would make you feel safe and happy here. Over the following weeks, Thomas grew stronger. The physical recovery continued, he gained weight steadily, his energy returned, his color improved. But more importantly, he began to rediscover joy. Annetta came every morning, just as she had for 32 years, But now her first stop was always Thomas's room. They'd have breakfast together at the kitchen table, that same old wooden table where they'd shared so many conversations over the years. Thomas would tell her about his dreams, his thoughts, his slowly returning hopes for the future. Richard kept his promise about being present. He restructured his entire work schedule, taking meetings from home, saying no to trips, making it clear to everyone that his son came first. He and Thomas started having adventure days, simple outings to parks, museums, bookstores. Nothing elaborate, just time together, learning to be father and son again. The nightmares became less frequent. The fear in Thomas's eyes gradually faded. He started laughing again, real, genuine laughter that lit up his whole face. One afternoon, 6 weeks after the wedding that never was, Annetta stood at the kitchen window watching Thomas play in the garden. He was running through the grass with a soccer ball, Richard chasing after him, both of them laughing. Thomas was still thin, still healing, but he moved with energy and life that had been absent for so long. The criminal trial was pending. Natalie Pearson remained in custody without bail, facing charges that would likely put her away for decades. The media attention had been intense at first, but had begun to fade. The Westbridge family was slowly reclaiming their privacy. Annetta's daughter had called that morning, proud of her mother but worried about her. "You're famous now, Mom. Everyone's calling you a hero." But Annetta didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd simply refused to look away when it mattered most. She thought about all the people at that wedding who'd seen Thomas and noticed nothing. The guests who'd accepted Natalie's explanations without question. The doctors who'd signed off on fake diagnoses. The teachers who'd accepted excuses for Thomas's absences. Even Richard, who'd lived in the same house and somehow missed his son's deterioration. It wasn't that they were bad people. They were just not paying attention, not looking closely enough, not trusting their instincts when something felt wrong. How many children suffered in silence because the adults around them chose convenience over vigilance? How many predators succeeded because good people didn't want to cause a scene or make accusations or risk being wrong? Annetta had almost been one of those people. She'd almost accepted Natalie's lies, almost dismissed her own concerns as overreaction. If she'd waited even one more day, if she'd chosen silence over courage. But she hadn't. She'd looked. She'd seen. She'd acted. And because of that, Thomas was alive. Through the window, she watched Richard scoop Thomas up and spin him around, both of them dizzy with laughter. Thomas's face was radiant, free of fear, full of the simple joy that every child deserved. The back door opened and Thomas ran inside, breathless and glowing. "Annetta! Did you see? I almost scored a goal on Dad!" "I saw, sweetheart. You're getting so fast. Dad says we can get ice cream after dinner. Will you come with us?" "Of course I will." Thomas threw his arms around her waist, hugging her tight. "I love you, Annetta. I love you too, Thomas. So much." As Richard came inside, grass-stained and happy, he caught Annetta's eye and mouthed a silent thank you. She nodded. No words were needed. That evening, the three of them sat in the garden as the sun set, eating ice cream and watching fireflies begin to dance in the gathering dusk. Thomas sat between Richard and Annetta, secure in the knowledge that he was loved, protected, and truly seen. This was what family looked like, Annetta thought. Not perfection, not wealth or status or grand gestures, just presence, attention, the willingness to look closely, to listen carefully, to act courageously when something precious was at risk. She'd spent 32 years in quiet service, fading into the background, maintaining her place. But when it mattered most, she'd stepped forward into the light, and in doing so, she'd learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the most profound act of love is simply refusing to look away, even when it's hard, even when it costs you everything, even when everyone else has accepted the lie. You look, you see, you act, and you save the life that needs saving. Thomas laughed at something Richard said, and the sound carried across the garden like music. Alive. Safe. Healing. Annetta smiled and took another bite of her ice cream, content in the knowledge that she'd kept her promise. She'd protected him, and she always would.